Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
I'm sure you've heard of the term control freak. It's all too common in our society for people to be controlling, and there are many reasons why people become controlling. We can obviously guess at some of them. So how do we deal with the concept of over-control? Can we be over-controlling? Can we try to control another? Are we controlled by another? We have a sense of knowing when we feel controlled. It feels uncomfortable. We have a gut feeling when we're manipulated. Unfortunately, it's very common and not very tangible. We're not necessarily looking at violence, although that can be part of it. We're looking at what is more invisible. So I am very, very pleased to introduce my guest, Dr. Lisa Fontes, who is the author of Invisible Chains, Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationship. Welcome, Dr. Lisa Fontes.
Thank you, Dr. Duffy. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much. So you wrote this book. It's very heartfelt. Why you wrote this book. Would you care to talk about that?
Sure. Well, in my 30 or so years working in the fields of child abuse and domestic violence or domestic abuse, I saw many people, but especially many women. Let's not pretend there isn't a gender element here. Many women who were dominated by their intimate partners. And I guess another way you could phrase that is many men who were dominating their intimate partners, especially their women partners, but sometimes also men. And I was, like everyone else, trying to understand this and trying to figure out the best way to address it when I came across the wonderful book by Evan Stark, which he published in 2007, Coercive Control. And that was about men's domination of women in personal life. It's an amazing book. It's an absolutely groundbreaking book, but it's also a really difficult read with, and I really felt that this concept needed to be brought to a wider public. So I worked on the book Invisible Chains. There's a little bit of my own experience in a relationship that certainly, I think, gave me insight into the experiences of others, but it is not a personal story.
Yes, it's not a personal story. You just introduce yourself in the beginning of the book. Yes, this is not at all a memoir or autobiography. This is a scholastic work that I was very pleased to read for something that is palatable by the general public, because it is so needed by the general public. But I was struck by the fact, Dr. Fontes, that the point that you made that you don't have to, as a female, be uneducated, ignorant in various ways. You talk of yourself as a educated professional, very aware woman who found herself in the throes of this, the subtlety of it. I'm thinking about the boiling frog story. Do you know the boiling frog, where if a frog falls into boiling water, it quickly can save itself to jump out. But if it falls into tepid water, which gradually increases in degree, then it boils to death.
Yeah, I think that's a good metaphor. And often relationships, of course, of control start with a good dose of romance. So it can feel like a dream come true. The person who becomes coercively controlling at first may seem very loving. They want to spend all their time with you. They don't want to be interrupted by other people. They want to go everywhere you go. They may shower you with gifts and cards and very quickly tend to profess their love or their commitment, and they demand a similar thing from you. So coercive control relationships often really start in a whirlwind. And I have spoken to many women who, when the relationship started, they may not have even felt the same way towards the person who became coercively controlling of them. But when after 3 weeks, he said, I love you, or he said, let's move in together, or he said, I want you to have my baby, somehow those romantic ideas, or they felt romantic at the time, were very seductive, and they felt like they had to respond in kind. And so that can be a red flag. If you don't mind, I'd like to talk about the tactics of coercive control. Would that be a good idea?
Whatever you'd like to talk about.
Okay, so what happens when one person coercively controls their intimate partner? One aspect of that is isolation. And isolation isn't necessarily moving far away from known people, but you know what? Sometimes it is. Let's move to the suburbs. Let's move to another country. Let's move to another state. But isolation can also happen by requiring that the person spend all their time with you and with no one else, that they turn off their phone. Maybe the abuser is drunk anytime other people come over or asks intrusive questions so that people stop coming over. Another tactic of coercive control is monitoring, which of course is much easier with technology. So monitoring, it could be demanding passwords or finding out passwords, secretly finding out somebody else's passwords, tracking their car with a GPS, tracking their phone, which is very easy to do, having access to their computer. You really feel like somebody knows what's happening inside your head if they have access to your computer. Another tactic of coercive control is intimidation. It might be physical violence, but it might not be direct physical violence at your person. So it could be threatening. It could be standing and looming over the person who's being victimized, punching walls, throwing things, kind of backing somebody into a room, driving too fast. Those are all forms of intimidation. There are often mind games as another tactic of coercive control. So I'm sure you've heard about gaslighting. Gaslighting is where someone tries to make their partner, not necessarily their partner, but we're talking about partners here. So gaslighting is where someone tries to make their partner think that they're crazy and tries to make other people think that the partner is crazy. So discrediting what they know. And that bruise on your arm, I did not punch you yesterday, or I didn't grab you, or I'm sure I didn't press that hard on you when we were having sex. So you must have gotten that some other way. Or I didn't say that. Or this fight is your fault. So those are all forms of gaslighting. One of the first things that often happens in coercive control is what we call love bombing, which is like a cult. So it's using loving acts to keep the person trapped. So they just feel so overwhelmed by the professions of love, by the gifts, by the demands that they spend time together, that it feels really quite overwhelming. And people often respond without thinking because they're responding really in a more emotional way rather than in a thinking way to what's happening. Then there's also verbal abuse. So belittling someone, degrading them, criticizing them. Now, of course, people say things that are unkind to each other in relationships all the time. That doesn't mean it's coercive control. But if it's one way or constant or particularly cruel or frequent, then that may be one of the signs of coercive control. Just a couple more I'm going to go through. Another tactic of coercive control is micromanaging. So trying to control exactly what your partner is doing and how they're doing it. It could be in general. So like wanting a minute by minute or hour by hour accounting of how they spent their day. It could be on specific matters like, I want you to wear your hair just like this. I want you to do your nails just like this. I want you to wear your certain clothing just like this. Being picky about housekeeping. Being picky about one thing does not constitute coercive control. I mean, some people like their toilet paper fold, from the front, and others like it from the back. Or towels folded X way instead of Y way. One little thing doesn't constitute coercive control. But when a person feels like somebody else is controlling the everyday, minute by minute running of their lives, that may be coercive control. Physical abuse may be present. It may be mild. So in couples where one person is dominating and physically abusing the other, there is frequent mild physical abuse. So grabbing, pushing, maybe a little pulling of hair, maybe hurting them during sex. And those are not the big assaults. There may not ever be big assaults, but it's kind of the constant physical intimidation. And there's a lot of sexual coercion and causing pain sexually in a whole range of ways. So those are some of the tactics of coercive control. And it's a pretty overwhelming thing if it's happening in your relationship. Not all of them have to be present at all for coercive control, but if there's a number of them and one of the partners feels unfree and feels dominated, it's certainly worth learning more about coercive control.
Yes, wonderful, Dr. Lisa Fontes. And the title of your book is Invisible Chains, Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationship. I think you are describing, unfortunately, what I wouldn't say that's the complete norm in intimate relationships, but when you look at the gender factor, and as you write about, males are taught that they will be taken care of, and females are taught that they will be the caretakers, and the old romantic notions of being swept off one's feet, being taken over, a male being in charge, him knowing better somehow. And I also like that you don't limit it just to that females can also coercively control, as can gay couples and any kind of alternative sexual lifestyle. Because as a psychotherapist, I do have male clients who are being controlled by their wives. The idea of the gaslighting, the more subtle things. But as you write, if you loved me, you would do this and that. And where they don't feel they have choice, that's a good term, unfree. So we go quickly from the honeymoon stage into this period of coercive control. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about how love bombing is also very often applied to narcissists. You don't talk about narcissism per se in your book.
Yeah, can I explain that?
Of course.
Sure. So narcissistic personality disorder is a mental health diagnosis, as you know. And some people have what we call narcissistic traits without having the full disorder. I don't find it helpful to talk about narcissism, but I know certainly a lot of people do, and it helps them understand what's going on. I have to say that in almost every thing I read where someone talks about narcissism in terms of couple life, I think that they should use the word abuse or abuser instead. And I think that when we use the term narcissism, a lot of time we're letting the abuser off the hook because we're saying, well, that's just the way he is. That's how he's built. I have to learn how to live with him better. But abusive actions are a choice each and every time. And so I don't want to let people off the hook by saying, oh, this is their personality disorder. Of course, there are mental health contexts in which that makes sense. But I think when we're talking about relationships and we're talking about someone mistreating their partner, I don't think it's the most helpful, for me at least, way to think of things. I prefer to talk about their behavioral patterns and to talk about abuse and abusers rather than narcissists.
I can appreciate that. I like the idea of not wanting to give someone a diagnosis and making them therefore fairly innocent. The idea of these kinds of patterns being a choice, I certainly agree with you that we have a choice over our behaviors. But I'm also thinking about people who are so ingrained in their mindset, in their mental view of the world, in their patterns of behavior, that's just the way they treat someone. And then if the person who's being controlled protests, then they can move into gaslighting behavior, victim, as you talk about, playing the victim, being angry, instantly angry if the person being controlled pushes back. So that whole element there of choice of the person who's abusing and the person who's being abused. I think it's important to look at that from both sides.
Sure. And I think there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying. So one of the things I will ask people, when they say, well, that's just the way he is, I'll say, does he act that way with his boss? Does he act that way with his coworkers? Does he act that way with his neighbors, with people who attend the same religious institution? So sometimes, yes, sometimes people are just all around abusive and angry and combative with others, but usually not. Usually they are restricting that side of themselves to their intimate partner and often to their children. Maybe not when their children are young, but with their children when their children get a little older. And so I have to say that there is an element of choice in there. Now, that's where we come to batterer intervention programs, which should be 26 to 52 weeks long. The shorter programs, the online programs, forget it. They don't work. They're not useful. And anger management is definitely the wrong forum and will not help somebody who's coercively controlling, because the problem is not an outburst of anger or repeated outbursts of anger. The problem is, as you said, an attitude towards their partner and an attitude towards themselves, which they give themselves permission to hurt and control and dominate their partner. So when I say choice, I don't mean something that can easily be changed. What I mean is, when people think, oh, he's doing that because he's a narcissist, or he's doing that because he's drinking, and if he only stops drinking, he won't be hurting me anymore. Unfortunately, that's not true. The great majority of the time, that's not true. Drinking may exacerbate the coercive control, but the coercive control is an attitude towards the partner and, a behavioral pattern with the partner that the person is indulging in. They don't indulge it with their boss because there's consequences, but they may allow themselves to act that way with their intimate partner because they don't see any consequences.
Yes. And a sense of entitlement, male privilege, patriarchy. All of these things are so embedded in our culture, even among educated people.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that sometimes women coercively control men, and that coercive control happens in same-sex relationships. So let me talk about that first part about women coercively controlling men. Certainly it does happen. Usually there's some kind of structural difference between the man and the woman that gives the woman the upper hand. So maybe he doesn't have immigration papers and she's native born in the U.S. Or maybe she's very wealthy and he's not. Or maybe, she owns the place where they live and he's dependent on her in some way. Or he has a disability. there may be something else and maybe not that gives her the upper hand over him. The little research that has been done on it shows that when men are victims in a coercively controlling relationship with a woman, it's easier for them to leave, and they are less apt to feel physically intimidated, and they are less apt to be sexually assaulted by their female partner. So certainly, I am in no way saying that, women are angels and would never control their male partners if they could. But what I'm saying is when that begins to happen, it tends to be easier for men to get out of the relationship because of those reasons I just mentioned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're talking about Dr. Lisa Fontes, more societal things or hard data. I'm thinking about men who are very insecure and feel unlovable, unworthy. And I have a number of professional men in my practice who, to the world standards, have it all. They have all the prestige, the money, everything. And yet they are being manipulated and mistreated and even used by their female partners. So,
and isn't it interesting, though, that kind of insecurity in a man could lead him to could contribute to him being trapped in a coercive controlling relationship as a victim, but it could also contribute to him being coercively controlling because he feels like he has to monitor her whereabouts because of his jealousy. He doesn't trust that she's going to stick around, that she's telling him the truth. So we can certainly see it in a variety of directions.
Definitely, both ways. And since you don't want to do a medical diagnosis for coercive controllers, who does it? I mean, if we're looking at the gender paradigm and patriarchy, it's clear it's males, but not all males are coercively controlling. So how do we separate the wheat from the chaff?
Sure. I'm really glad you asked that. Most men are not coercively controlling. That doesn't mean that there's a perfect gender balance in terms of power in the relationship, but, making a few more decisions, that's not being coercively controlling. And it often happens in relationships that one person, is kind of the boss of the kids, let's say, and maybe of their social calendar, and another person controls the money and vacations, that kind of thing doesn't mean there's coercive control. It's really the constant actions to dominate the other person, and that is what the coercive control is. And honestly, that's what domestic abuse is. Domestic abuse is not a series of physical attacks. If there is a physical attack on January 1st and there's a physical attack on July 1st, that doesn't mean that nothing happened between January 1st and July 1st. And it's everything that happened between January 1st and July 1st that is the coercive control. The manipulation, the spying, the micromanaging, and so on.
And Dr. Lisa Fontes, the most popular used word last year was gaslighting, and it's come into the literature, come into the vernacular from the movie in the 1930s. I'm so surprised they never did a remake on this movie. Most people never even saw the movie. But could you address that some more? Because it can be quite subtle. Sometimes, like in the movie, she put her gloves on the stairs somewhere and he said, "No, you didn't. They were there." I mean, that's palpable. Right. But the whole idea of you made it up, it's not true, and just dominating her point of view, like she's always wrong, and it's invalidating her point of view.
Right. So, I mean, I can give you some examples from people I have worked with, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, but this really would apply to quite a few different people. I work as an expert witness in domestic violence cases or domestic abuse and coercive control cases. And frequently I see a pattern of sexual domination by the male partner in a way that hurts, physically hurts, and psychologically hurts the female partner, whether it's demanding certain acts, whether it's demanding the making of sexual videos, whether it's sharing or threatening to share sexual photographs, whether it's frequency, disregarding that she's pregnant or has a UTI or isn't in the mood, that kind of domination. So there's a lot of room for gaslighting around that. If you weren't such a prude, it's your problem that you're frigid. Why don't you ever initiate sex? It's your fault that we have such a negative sex life because you have a bad attitude about sex. So that's just one arena in which gaslighting happens. It's painful. But of course, if we picture that happening around a lot of different arenas, a person can begin to lose their sense of what reality is. I don't mean totally, they're not psychotic. I'm not saying that. But Evan Stark referred to this as perspecticide. So you hear it's sort of got the word perspective in there, perspecticide. And he defines perspecticide as the abuse-induced inability to know what you know. In other words, maybe that you shouldn't be treated in X way, but after years of abuse, you've come to accept it. Or, one woman wasn't allowed to have her own toothbrush by her partner. This was a professional woman. She wasn't allowed to close the door when she used the toilet. And she knew that this didn't make sense, but on the other hand, she'd been worn down by years of living with her husband. And so this is, it's real. The effects of living with somebody who's gaslighting you constantly is really damaging. And I do want to end. I do want to have a little bit of an optimistic note here. Is that time away from the relationship, people recover.
Yeah, people recover. And the good news here is that we are coming back next week. And so if you are feeling awful, if you're feeling this is too familiar for you or someone and it feels like such a mucky muck, such an entrapment, which is the word that you use, Dr. Fontes, for the extreme cases, please come back next week because Dr. Fontes is going to be explaining how to get out of this kind of relationship. Dr. Lisa Fontes, author of Invisible Chains, Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationship. Now, can people access the book itself anywhere, right? Bookstores, online. And what about a website? Is there something that people can look at?
Sure. So my website is lisafontes.com, lisafontes.com. And they can access the book there. It's for sale in online sellers. Bookstores, maybe yes, maybe no. But they can certainly order it from bookstores as well.
So I look forward to next week, Dr. Fontes. And to everyone, this is Dr. Duffy Spencer wishing you great relationships.